it happened. We are talking today, Shannon Winton, about speculative satire, which is something that I love to read, but don't write so much. So I'm very interested in what Shannon's going to be talking about for sure. Also coming up next week as well, we do have filter verbs, and that's going to be presented by AP Hawkins. Uh, there's a lot of ways to make sure that your writing flows very well, and those filter verbs, you don't even notice it as you're writing it. This is where first draft becomes a later draft. Is look at how well you are using your verbs, and actually, you got to just push the story ahead. In the meantime, Shannon, we're going to get to you because I know you have 375 slides to get through in 25 minutes. Once again, I'm just being satirical. Take it away.
You're not being that far off. I do tend to overload my presentation. So let us get started. We are talking about writing speculative satire. So before we go too far, just a little bit about me. I am Shannon Winton. I am one of the founders of the Houston Independent Authors, along with Sean. I'm also the coordinator for the Houston chapter of the Editorial Freelancers Association. I have been a writer since as long as I can remember being able to write. But I began editing, I want to say about 13 years ago. I've been doing it professionally for over a decade, and work almost exclusively with genre fiction writers. I'm also one of the coordinators for the Houston Science Fiction and Fantasy Meetup Group, one of the founders of the Tomeworks Editing Collective, and creator of the class editing science fiction and fantasy for the Editorial Freelancers Association, which is active right now. We're in another cycle of it, and it's been great. So that's a little bit about my background, and who I am, and how much joy I find in being a sci-fi nerd. And so those are some of my laurels here and why you're listening to me today. Now let's talk a little bit about what we are planning to talk about in this next 45, 50 minutes. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of satire, and we're going to divide satire up into three different groups. We're going to talk about how you can show satire both on the entire storyline, as well as how to use satire at the line level a little bit. This is going to be kind of a 101, so I can't go too deep into anything because I already know that I'm going to go long. um, what the impact on the world is and the reasons to write it. I've got satirical devices in there twice, but I should not. The common speculative genres that lend themselves to satire. This is not telling you you cannot write satire in one of these genres in a certain way that's not listed, just where you will find that kind of satire most often. There are a lot of criticisms of satire, and we're going to troubleshoot some of them before you write, or if you've already heard them, what these could be stemming from, and the actual value. We will talk about why we do this, why we write satire to begin with, because there are reasons. It's not just that we want to make fun of people or be bullies or because we've got nothing better else to do, but that's what we'll be talking about today. So this is a very short history of satire. And if you were educated originally, like I was in the state of Texas, you will not know most of this because our expression of what classical cultures were like and indigenous peoples usually don't include as many penises as they actually like to engage with. So, where we think satire actually came from, or some of the earliest representations of satire, included things that were called sacred clowns. Sacred clowns show up in a lot of different early cultures. I think the one that I've got the picture of is one of the Pueblo versions of a sacred clown. There's numerous names for sacred clowns, but basically, sacred clowns are a person dressed up as a mockable entity or an effigy. And there will be ritualistic hazing and dehumanizing of that character. And a lot of times there was religious precedents to make this happen, and some of it, wasn't. But essentially, it was the degradation of a symbol of threat in order to remove its power, and also create catharsis or pent-up rage at that thing. And it created some cultural connection when all rub shit on the same thing. which helped to diffuse interpersonal tension. So when you're like, wait a minute, what are you saying is going on? I mean, this is something that was very common though across the board because engaging in these things that seem to be like antisocial actually created community bonding. And so like our earliest known versions of satire look like that. It's not like people couldn't criticize or be sarcastic, in other ways, but we still have either oral histories or representations or figurines or the art that was made for some of these different sacred clowns so that we can learn from them. In antiquity, this was kind of talked about. Aristotle said in his Poetics, and I kind of bastardized the first one because I think it's funnier this way, but comedy has no history because at first nobody took it seriously. And he also says comedy aims to represent men as worse than they are and tragedy as better than they are in real life. So I think that's a fun little thing. When we first look at satire in written histories, the oldest ones that we have are Egyptian. I don't think we've got anything that's Mesopotamian. But basically, the first ones we found, we're not sure if they're actually supposed to be funny or not. But they're messages to other slate writers saying slate writers are better than everybody else at doing nothing. And so what it basically says is like, oh, you sit around and write other people's words all day. You're amazing because you don't have real life. And so it's a joke that has gone through history and it still doesn't quite land. But the very first satires that we know of running from the ancient Greeks were actually what they would just call comedy. And as I talked about the sacred clowns, a lot of old comedy was actually rooted in sacred clown behavior. Um, Basically, there would be processions and parades that were relatively religious, but not because they were filled with a bunch of drunk people roaming through the streets, either in caricature, wearing phalluses, and singing bawdy songs. And that's our friendly ancient Greeks. And so when they did this, they eventually did move it onto the stage. The term satire was not applied at that time. That's something that's a relatively modern term for this kind of behavior. But satire itself is the art of making somebody or something look ridiculous. There's a lot of reasons to do it. It's funny. It also embarrasses the subject. And so if you're looking to embarrass them, you can use satire to do it. If there are people who are experts or people who have power, this just, doing satire discredits them. And then it also humbles them. So when we first started seeing old comedy in ancient Greece, it was around the 400s. And we don't have those original pieces, unfortunately. So we don't know 100% about what those look like, but it appears to be almost like variety shows that turned closer into plays that mirrored more of the dramatic elements that we would see in the tragedies. And so it took about 60 years, and old comedy became, again, more dramatic. The most famous satirist that we still have information from, like there could have been other people whose works just simply did not make it through history, but the most famous one we know of Aristophanes, and this guy was amazing and crazy. And I have a feeling you probably did not learn a lot about him. But he had over 40 plays, only about 11 of them still exist to this day. And his comedies criticized the Peloponnesian War, the way the government was run. He liked to make fun of Eurydice, like he was dogged down on Eurydice. And then he was very focused on specific public figures, most notably Socrates, and then also Cleon. And if you're not a history buff, you probably don't know a lot about Cleon, but he was a very popular demagogue and general and politician during the Peloponnesian War. And when there was uprisings, he would say, "Well, let's just murder them all and rape their wives and children." And that was big. He got into power because he basically gave money for jury duty, but then taxed everybody higher. So, fun guy, but we're not really focused on him. I want to talk to you guys about the clouds. Sean, have you read The Clouds or seen it produced?
No, I do not know this one. I do know of it. But no, haven't. No. My I
Okay.
sorry, I'm trying to read this real quick. Wasn't this as well like something about the Deus Ex Machina? Like this is one of the origins of it?
I don't think I've ever seen this one being registered as Deus Ex Machina, but I know Aristophanes does do that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I'm fairly certain not this one. So I'm going to try to relay what the clouds is because again, this is like probably the very first true satire that we still have record of. And basically, it's a testament against Sophic thinking. The general plot is bonkers. So, an old man and his son are sleeping in a flea ridden bed, and the old man is complaining because his adult or adolescent son has basically spent all their money on horse races and the creditors are coming from them. And the son says that, Socrates has a way of measuring the distance a flea can hop. And he was like, well, if he can make that stuff up, maybe he can teach you how to use rhetoric to stop our creditors from taking all of our money. And so the kid says, I don't want to do it. And the old man, his father, decides to go to Socrates to see if he could. Socrates is shown off to be a complete huckster. He's like trying to climb into the sky in a basket so he can look down on the sun. There is a lot of very obvious metaphor and symbolism that still works because he's like, clearly the gods love me because look how nice the day is. And clearly, I am favored because blah, blah, blah. So he looks like a shitbag. And he says, okay, old man, I will take you to my school. The old man fails to understand what he is supposed to do and learn how to use rhetoric to basically get what he wants. So Socrates makes him sleep outside and says, look at the clouds and determine what the clouds want for you. And so the old man just masturbates in a field. Finally, Socrates gets so tired of him that he was like, you go home and send somebody else to learn for you. So he sends his son, and then there is this bonkers, like 20-minute long fight between traditional values and Sophic values, and both of them are personified as giant chickens. And Sophic values has a huge penis, like the character is supposed to walk around with like a 4 foot dildo during this fight with with the traditional values, and they roam around the sun until he finally picks Sophic values and essentially learns the ways of Socrates. So then he goes home and tries to convince his father to say certain things to the debtors, and none of them work because the debtors are like, "Or did you just forget how to speak English? Because you don't seem to understand, not English. Did you forget how to speak because your grammar is wrong and you're telling me I can't do something because of grammar, but I obviously am going to get my money today. I don't care if you say there are two Tuesdays, and that kind of stuff." And so it doesn't work. And then the son tries to convince his father that he should be allowed to beat his father and that it is right and that traditional morals are wrong and he should be able to beat his father. And so there's a big fight about that until the son says, well, I should be able to beat your wife too. And then the old man, angry, creates a horde of his slaves with like chains and fire and burns down Socrates' thinkery. Um, in the middle of all this, for totally unrelated reasons, the clouds themselves, which act as the chorus. In an old comedy, the chorus is the way for the author to send in his own viewpoints for the story. So it's like a deicide or a breaking of the fourth wall. This whole play was originally sent in as a tribute in a competition, which is very common back in ancient Greece. And it basically came third out of three. And so he rewrote the play to change what the clouds said, and we don't know what the original chorus words were. But throughout the entire thing, the clouds are basically threatening the judges of this competition that if they don't pick this one as the winner, then the gods are going to frown down upon them, and the sun will beat too hard, and it'll destroy the crops and ruin the economy and turn everybody into, debtors themselves and that kind of thing. So it's bonkers. But what it did, even though it wasn't very popular in its own times, was made people think about how Socrates behaved, how the students coming out of his thinkery behaved, how they spoke and used Sophic reasoning in ways that were bad for the state. And Plato actually credits the clouds as being a significant contributing factor to turning public opinion against Socrates, which then led to his trial and subsequent execution in 399 BC. And this is probably one of the reasons why we still have information about this play today, because it was a very clear and delineated impact on the society of the time, and with the philosopher that we still recognize and we still read about and learn from in our modern times. When we think about it that way, though, because the clouds, because the sun, because um, the use of these anthropomorphic ideas or these anthropomorphized ideas, we can see some of those very early things that we considered dramatic satire in a lot of ways are actually speculative. So there's actually quite a few classes of satire because satire became very popular in antiquity, and the way in which satire was delivered to the masses in dramatic pieces fell really into three basic categories. So you have Juvenalian, which is what we probably think about when you think about satire. It's abrasive, it's very critical. The subject matter, whatever that the author is talking about, is considered evil. And the story reveals that evilness where other people or the reader or the audience doesn't normally see it because it's covered by a mask. This often uses exaggeration and parody to make the subject appear monstrous and ridiculous and awful. And a lot of times it's not necessarily funny, or if it is, it's using dark humor. So examples, modern examples of this would be like American Psycho, we all know Modest Proposal, Animal Farm, or Fight Club. The next one I want to talk about is Horatian satire. This is a lot softer. It's much more sympathetic with the subject matter. And it does still engage with the readership or the audience to try to enact social change, but it's mostly doing it by smiles, not anger. It's entertaining, not enraging. And there's gentle instruction, gentle or implicit be better. So it's not as aggressive or acerbic. Examples of this would be like The Simpsons or King of the Hill, or Oscar Wilde's comedies like The Importance of Being Earnest, where it's focusing on the silly things in the person's life that they do that makes stuff a little bit worse around them or complicates matters. It is not necessarily as aggressive. And then there's Menippean satire. And this is one you'll see a lot in speculative science fiction because one of the focuses is on how a person's philosophy or worldview is impacting how they live their life or how they treat others around them. So they remove the person or the character representing that worldview from the world we live in, plunk them into a different world where if they try to use those philosophies or worldviews, it causes chaos and destruction to the individual. So basically, it's carnivalization of the subject matter. This is your surrealist satire. And it casts a really wide net most of the time on what it's actually criticizing, because it'll criticize numerous things all at once. And then it includes destabilization of those worldviews or philosophies by basically showing them out of context and how they don't work. And then the storytelling and frame styles tend a little bit more towards literary in this way. And we'll talk a little bit about literary fiction and how it plays into satire in a little bit. But examples of this would be like Alice in Wonderland or Catch 22 or even The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Because again, these are stories where the main character exits the ordinary world into a completely surrealistic space where all of their points of view and all of the things that they do to maintain themselves in the normal world go out the window and are no longer useful or functional. All right, so I'm skipping quite a bit. And it's not like you don't have satire throughout history, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the changes to what was satirized in our most recent history. The very first 20th century satire was political satire. It was a magazine. I shouldn't say the only, but one of the biggest and most influential of the very early 20th century was Die Fackel, which is an Austrian magazine which mocked modern day politics, and called out the hypocrisy and corruption of the Habsburg Empire as it was dying. And then later against actors that were, contributing to the First World War. They were sued numerous times, and it was one of the early fights against refusing people's ability to criticize. And so a lot of the things that were decided at that time, even though it wasn't very apparent, included the right to mock public figures in Austria. And it became one of those things that, even though it had already been entrenched in certain places, the ability to ridicule the power structures became much more common and promoted as we moved away from monarchy. And this was one of the ways where we won. Um, when you look at satire that was famous and influential throughout the 20th century, there were certain things that were pretty common. And the early 20th century, again, was a lot of rage against these monarchies. And then it moved to rage against industrialization. And it moved against rage against total government control or the robotization of our workforce during modernization, a reduction of human influence in production of goods, and then moved on to imperial war. And for America, the war machine there, or after the war, the problems with the monotony of middle class living in the American dream. There was a significant uprising of anti hippie and we consider very right leaning satire that occurred during the 70s and continued on throughout politics in the 80s and 90s, which isn't saying it couldn't be from both sides. But there was just a much more use of satire just in general in political rhetoric after World War II. Even to the point where you didn't know what people were going to be making fun of or who they were going to be attacking. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between modern comedy and satire. Generally speaking, if you are working on a comedy or something that is just simply comedic, the comedy tends to accept the rules of the social engagement, and satire subverts them. Comedy may have no social commentary, call for change or improvement of the subject matter audience. Physical comedy isn't saying don't step on bananas or anything like that. There's not necessarily a learned outcome or a change you're supposed to make in your life based upon general comedy. Satire itself includes reflection, and may not be humorous at all. I think we've already kind of said that. Severe subject matter may not include any humor. And you can have satire that is severe. But you could also have, satire that isn't, and it is humorous. But these are not mutually exclusive from one or the other, and there is a lot of mixing. Caricature and parody are also not satire, but they are tools of satire. Caricature is oversimplification or exaggeration of a subject's attributes, and it can be used to mock or it can be used to compliment. So if you look in magazines that show a big strong man and he's got much larger muscles than would be realistic to his frame in real life, that's still caricature, even if it's possibly trying to show the person is more manly or have attributes that are laudable. Parody is mockery of a subject, but that mockery could just be on the building blocks of the story itself or critique of that art without a larger implication. So it may not have deeper social or political meaning. If you grew up in the 90s like I did, you probably saw a lot of like terrible parody movies. I think there's like teen movie and like scary movie and all those things that didn't really have anything to say about society as a whole. And they were just making fun of other intellectual properties and movies that had come out before them. Neither, again, has an implicit call for the audience to make a change in their lives or to have a different view of a subject matter or principle. Both of these just have comedic effect in essence. We have defining traits of satire. And I'm sorry if this is the boring part of the story. Irony is something that satire uses a lot, and it essentially says, one thing and means another, or if there's like an edifice or an object that the value of it is twisted around to kind of comedic effect. So if you have a story where a water park catches on fire, that's a form of irony. This is often confused with sarcasm, but sarcasm is actually a subset of irony in most cases. It uses that irony to belittle a subject for comedic effect. Sardonism is used a lot more in darker tales because it uses the irony to belittle the subject to a very serious effect. And so one of them is supposed to be enjoyable and one of them is supposed to be miserable. Fake praise is often used where untrue laurels and accolades are given to a subject to point out the ridiculousness of their decisions or behaviors. Like, we're so thankful to our mayor for raising our taxes because now we don't have to think about what we're going to do with all this money that we don't have, right? Like, it's very obviously not real. And then there will be obvious untruths and unacceptable but logical conclusions to either these edifices or philosophies. Like, you know, we have too many poor people who are starving. We have too many babies. Maybe we should make the poor eat babies. So those things should have been obviously untrue. And we'll talk about some problems with comedy, or excuse me, with satire. And one of them is that people take it seriously. And so in this particular instance, it was one of those situations where people took that way too seriously. Hyperbole is exaggerated details for emphasis. This is caricature, or it's literal interpretations of idioms. So if a stressed character's head literally explodes, that kind of thing. And then, generally speaking, speculative satire, especially, will have commentary on a direct subject or indirect subject, meaning the characters can be representative, or can represent, excuse me, a specific person in our real life or a specific political party, a specific social group, specific religious group. That is very obvious who it is representing, but it also reflects on those who share those beliefs. Now, I said this is more speculative, but that is very common across all of them. Like, all types of satire very clearly has a subject. Um, Generally speaking, if you're writing something that is a satire and speculative fiction, it should still have references to our modern day or issues that we struggle with, even if those issues have existed since the beginning of time. The personal viewpoints or the direction of the story, even if it is indirectly applied, the author's judgments are clear on the page and indicate that whatever the character's choices were or the erroneous philosophy that they are fighting against, that they have a corrected way to handle that situation or the subject matter. So, generally speaking, whenever we are writing, we have a point. We have a goal, we have an impression we want to leave on the reader. And it's important to remember that because when we're writing, if we are trying to write satire versus having satirical elements to our story, we need to keep the satire in mind because that satire should be built into the climax, whereas satirical elements may not. There are certain genres where satire is very common. So if we are looking at the genres where the character is taken from the normal world because we are attacking a philosophy, this Menippean kind of satire, then we're going to see more of that in the surrealist kind of science fiction or weird fiction. This is also very common in portal fantasy and isekai. So if that's what you're looking to do, these are some obvious places where you could put that kind of story if you have not written it already. Um, Juvenilian stories, again, these are the ones that are kind of more aggressive. And I don't want to say meaner because that's like a really weird way to put it, but they tend to have darker outcomes for the characters. They tend to have a lot of biting references and a lot more sadness and misery that go on throughout the story as the natural consequences of a certain powerful ideology or a certain ideology and power or a certain type of governance that leads to these darker outcomes. So Juvenalian satire is very common in dystopia, if you could not, imagine. So, um, even though, the dystopia may be about a completely different kind of government, usually there will be clear references to what's going on in our world or particular political parties that we are currently dealing with and how their ideologies will impact um, basically future us if allowed to continue. Generally, future punks are, rising up against a powerful or power structure in a very similar way. So those often have a little bit more information, like snuck in, about how to rebel. Near future science fiction is a lot of fun because it shows you the immediate impacts of these changes. So we're seeing a whole lot of things where AI is built into stories now, and how AI is going to either replace our jobs or it's going to cause us to have a change in how we relate to each other because the allure of an AI girlfriend or an AI companion or a sycophant that's inside of your phone is much greater than dealing with another human being with their own takes on your behavior or their own needs that don't allow you to be purely selfish. Dark Superhero also has this. You can raise your hand if anybody's seen The Boys. But we look at a meritocracy in that particular one, even though it's very far away lens of what happens when the amount of power you have influences, or excuse me, the amount of like your special skills influences the amount of power you have over regular people in these situations. Galactic science fiction also tends to do this because we're looking at like Imperial War. Even though we are not currently dealing with Imperial War, forces coming in and colonizing are things that have happened a lot through human history, and in certain respects continue to happen even if they're not on a battlefield. So you'll see these themes and you'll see these things inside of the galactic and like war fiction and science fiction. And then alt history shows what would happen if the bad guys won. A lot of very good alt history uses whatever those bad guys were in the past to reflect a current leader, politician again, religion, and the current to show off what will happen if they do end up becoming primary or big leaders inside of our current sphere. And then lastly, oration. Oration again is the very sweet, very soft, like, don't do that. Because this is what'll happen. Cozies are very common to find Horatian satire, satirical elements. When I say cozies, I do want to make sure that it's clear that I'm talking actually about all cozies, because you will see this in speculative mystery cozies, where the main character sees a lot of caricatures of their cast, essentially, where they're meeting new people who are outsized versions. So the obnoxious and snooty millionaire woman, or like the very angry lawyer. Like these caricatures will be, I mean, these characters will be made bigger inside of these stories. And that can be for cozies that are like not speculative, but there are a lot of speculative cozies out there that also do this. Same thing is true for other speculative cozies. So Anna probably has a whole bunch that she can name off right now. But almost all speculative cozies will attack, and I don't want to use attack because that's kind of the wrong way to put it, but they do address situations where characters are being ostracized. So, in many ways, cozies are rebellion fiction against conservatism because their characters will either have different kinds of bodies or different kinds of skills or different lifestyles than the society around them. And that reflects the ostracization that they receive in our current society. So, even though cozies tend to have happy endings and they generally focus on creating a found family or a community of support, they do so while fighting these traditionalist values inside of the societies in those cozies. um, and when they do that, it shows the holes in either philosophy or the true ugliness behind the decisions of those people in power in the story and in the real world. Contemporary speculative romances also tend to have a gaggle of ridiculous characters, and oftentimes their caricatures are the kind of people we know, like the nosy neighbor, or the over gregarious friend, and that kind of thing. Upbeat RPGs like Legends and Lattes, which I would consider to be a cozy as well, tend to do this, where people just want to live in this environment or in this story world that they've gotten used to, but have an enjoyable time with it, because these characters or the characters in these stories often have similar characteristics, or they're similar enough that the readership enjoys the stories as if they were that primary character. They can see how the bad choices impact those around them without it being unforgivable. And the stories play heavily with those tropes. So, I want to talk now a little bit about the connection between satire and literary fiction. And Sean, I have a feeling you're going to bump into this a little bit. Emily, you just said,
Oh,
where
for
would the
sure.
Twilight Zone go? I feel like, generally speaking, because it's hard to say 100% since it is, multiple stories in there, but Twilight Zone tends to be juvenilian in my experience. There was a ton of stuff. I remember this one with Dennis Hopper, where he starts like a political party in the behest of this character who is like shrouded in an actual shadow. And the entire time, Dennis Hopper is creating this very militant group of people behind him based upon the advice of this guy in the shadows, and it turns out to be Hitler. So when I'm thinking about that, like that's one of the ones that I'm looking at. But the Twilight Zone also had a lot to say about war, about nationalism, about xenophobia. So I feel like that one in general, or even Black Mirror, are very Juvenilian in how they do their satire. All right, so literary fiction, and again, I have a feeling Sean will have a lot to say about this in my oversimplification of literary fiction. Literary fiction, when you are reading it, speculative literary fiction, all literary fiction, generally speaking, the story is not just the story. The story is a medium through which the author conveys a lesson to the reader. That may be a prolonged emotional sensation. It could be philosophies that that reader should carry on forward in their life. There should be resonance to alter a person's behaviors or the way that they interact with the world around them because they have been influenced by what they have learned from the story. And so literary fiction doesn't necessarily have the same kind of arc that we would think of in a traditional story. The elements that occur in the story may be more focused on the emotional resonance and the physical impact of the events of the story on the character, and the interior changes that happen within that character because of those things. And they're not as focused on the action sequences, the direct cause and effects in the physical world when they tell them. So, literary fiction doesn't necessarily have a climax. The climax could have been the first chapter. The climax could have been the middle. The climax just may not be there, because there's alterations in story structure too, in how the reader presents the story. You know, the beginning may be at the end, or it could be a frame story where it's a story where somebody is telling somebody else the story, and there's just differences in how the story is told, or it may be told out of order. Essentially, though, there may just simply be at the very end of the book something called a capstone moment, which highlights the point of the theme, whether it's resolved or not, or if the point of this erroneous philosophy that the character took their life is proven. And because of that, satire does share a lot of combination with literary fiction, even if it's not written in a literary way. But literary fiction or speculative literary fiction is the home of where you will find most satire because of those combined interests. And Sean has been very quiet. I don't know if he's busy or if he is
Man, you're
agreeing with
you're
me.
talking. I'm not going to talk over you.
um, do you have anything to add to this description
Oh,
since
so
you are a
much,
literary career?
absolutely. I always find it interesting, because I read a lot of literary and analyze it and stuff like that. And it is interesting to hear more genre-based, writers and readers think, "Hey, this doesn't have a climax," or like it's not in the same structure. I feel like so much literary fiction really does have that. It's just so interior that
Hmm.
it feels like it's not following the story structure as described. But if a literary analysis or whatever went through it, then they would say, oh, look, here's where the climax is, here's where the rising action is, here's where the darkest moment is. It just feels different because you're like, but nothing's happening. Anyway, that's to the
Well, yeah,
side.
yeah. So a lot of
What I
what
want
they're
to,
focused on is in the interior changes, right?
yeah,
Um,
but that's
and
separate
not a
from you.
physical like explosion
Yes, that's
in the
but that's separate
climax.
from you talking about speculative literary fiction, and it depends as well on whether you draw the line. Is Kurt Vonnegut literary or not? He has been adopted by literary people, but at the same time, came out of a genre, tradition. He was winning Hugos before he was winning Pulitzers, stuff like that. I is that literary? Well, it sure as fuck is satire, but I'm not gonna say that he did it in a literary way. Meanwhile, Thomas Pynchon, who should have, in my opinion, won for Gravity's Rainbow and stuff like that, won some speculative fiction awards back in the day, and this is brought up as well by um, filmmaker Paul Thomas Anderson, and his obsession with Pynchon and using him a lot in his using his novels a lot in his movies. So One Battle After Another is absolutely a literary satire, I would say, of like a revolutionary movement. I something as well out there like Inherent Vice is a satire of kind of a mystery. But these, in terms of the original Pynchon novels, especially, are written so interiorly that it's sometimes tough to pull out the satire in it and find it because it's people acting so poorly, so dumb, so misguided that it's a joke on itself. It's a joke on the literati from within. The call is coming from within the room. And so Thomas Pynchon is a great example of that literary fiction where you're using the overblown tropes, that John Updike uses like straight up seriously. And yet is like, but is this really how we are? Come on, guys. Come on.
Satire against satire is actually very common, but I knew you would have things to say. Um, all of those things are very true, and there are a lot of writers who are writing satire, who write in literary fiction, and poke fun at other satire, or they, as you said, they weren't initially trying to write literary fiction. They may have instead have been trying to write a specific kind of satire where that person leaves the normal world and has to struggle with their interior influences, and then it is taken in as satire, as Kurt Vonnegut often was, or what Kurt Vonnegut often wrote, and then subsequently was. So I did want to give you some time to soapbox, just because I feel like you have a lot to say here.
Thank you. I do appreciate
Um,
it.
sorry, what's that?
I said thank you. I do appreciate it.
So not all satire is literary fiction. Not all literary fiction is satire, but they are good friends. And when you're thinking about how to frame your story, or if you have something to say and you're trying to figure out how to write your story, you may be able to look to literary fiction to figure out how to convey those interior changes to the characters, that may not be really obvious on the page in genre fiction or in commercial fiction, even if it does focus on satirical elements or is like very clearly satire. So I wanted to pop that out there. Sean gave some really good examples. And I think it's something to think about if you are like just now engaging, if you're like the stuff that's going on around us is too bonkers. I can't believe there aren't as many people screaming as there should be. And I have to write about it. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about common things that come up when people write satires. Either these are things that people will say once you write the book and have released it and people have read it, or it may be coming from your beta readers or your critique partners. And let's talk about what these actual complaints mean and if there are things you can do to change your story or improve your story, or improve your writing in order to counter these off to have the most effective, um, not thinking of the right word, but like to have the best effect on your readership. Um, One of the things that a lot of people who write satire end up doing is they front load the story with a lot of jokes, a lot of satirical references. They will include a lot of mockery of people who they think their reader also wants to mock, and they give the impression that the story is that mockery. And if you're writing a story with satirical elements that is not actual satire, then those mockeries they don't actually run through the entire story. Then the climax, those things are not going to be there. It'll piss people off. They'll say you just stop being funny. So figure out what kind of humor you're actually using in the beginning parts of the story. Are you using slapstick? Do you have a whole bunch of puns or body comedy or gross out humor, pithy dialogue or whatever? And then when did those things stop in your story? Did you carry them out the entire time? Were they only in the first couple of chapters? And if those things were working, can you add them in to the next draft? Can you make the rest of the story, at least in sections, refer back to those jokes? Can you add a couple more turns of phrases inside of that story, like without destroying the emotional impact of the later scenes, which may be more dramatic? Conversely, if the issue is that there's a tone change because you had a whole bunch of comedy at the beginning and at the end, and you can't change the end, can you make the beginning a little bit darker without scaring away the reader? Sometimes the audiences miss the fact that this is mockery and they take the story seriously. Can't believe somebody would actually say we should eat a whole bunch of babies if we're poor. Um, a lot of times the issue with that, and in this particular case, Jonathan Swift's case, I mean, he was writing actual political rhetoric, it was nonfiction. But when people confuse the story for being serious in its satirical bombasticness or in its caricature reactions or the behaviors of the characters and seems to say these are okay ways to behave, it's because there's not any clarity between the narrative itself and the narrator slash the author's message. The distinction is lost. One of the ways to do this is to change the tone words or the way the narrator portrays the story. This can be as simple as adding judgments inside of your narrative. He was sadly murdered versus like they killed him, right? Um, Adding on something that appears to be a value judgment will help the reader understand what the narrator slash the author slash the readership should think about these experiences inside of the story. Sometimes you can also show the opposite of like the rival character and show where they win because you actually have the main character be the person who went the wrong way down. So if you can show a secondary character going on the right path to make good decisions and it be not part of the main story, at least not for the climax, but something that the audience can go like, they didn't make mistakes. It can give you it can give the readership the indication like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to take from it. The biggest problem though, again, is probably the narration inside of your story, the narrative voice, not being distinct enough from what appears to be the logical conclusion based upon what happened to based upon, excuse me, what happened to that character. More common issues when we talk about stuff in our stories that is very heavy. The subject matter itself can traumatize people who have experienced prejudice or who have been physically harmed, emotionally harmed by the things that are necessarily the content of your story. And they may not be able to safely engage with that. And we don't illegitimize somebody's trauma or their bad experiences. And we don't minimize it because those are cruel things. And if you are trying to use your story to do good in the world, the last thing you want to do is kick the people who you are stating you want to help because you're fighting against the people who are harming them. So, all that being said, you want to be able to evaluate your story for things that are triggering for people who have been victims of the kind of people who are in real life that are the subject matter of your story. use trigger warnings, right? Like we started using trigger warnings because we don't want to send people into tailspins or panic attacks. And if your story could do that, it's worth putting a trigger warning in. um, Define the representative characters in a more positive light as well. So if you know that you are not actually focusing on a particular class of people when you're making your criticism, but that class is reflected in some of the characters in your story, not showing them as a flat character, allowing them to have like a fully fleshed out personality inside of that story, even if it is not the primary goal, as long as it doesn't take away from your story, may also be helpful in showing them healing, or showing them as more than just a victim. And then also be very clear in your advertising if you're working in satire. You know, if you are advertising your satire as the parent genre that your satire is working in, people will stumble across it. Especially if you start getting popular, being told it's good, but not actually understanding the subject matter. And then they're confronted with this thing that actually hurts them. On the flip side, satire is often called bullying, and this makes sense. Satire is mean, it is intentionally caustic in many cases. And so if somebody tells you that your satire story is bullying, then check your privilege first, right? Don't just presume that they're being jackasses. And if you cannot figure out, and you have actually asked others around you who you trust to be honest and level-headed, what you have done wrong, and you literally cannot find it, evaluate who's making the criticisms and the motivation behind them. You know, if you have a reader who identifies with Nazis, but they don't want to outright say that they are a Nazi, they're going to find other secondary false arguments against your work so that they can inhibit you from doing more of it. And they will use therapy speak to fight you. They will utilize the communication styles of the oppressed to try to make you into a monster, and they will Darvo to avoid accountability. So I'm not saying this is something that you don't have to worry about, because there are times where your story may unintentionally be bullying. At least hopefully it's unintentionally, and it's worthwhile to go back and fix it. But there are also times, because you are going to get criticized for your work, to figure out if those criticisms are honest criticisms. Did you accidentally promote giving up? A lot of dystopia has this problem. Or if you've ever been told, you know, I really enjoyed the writing, I really enjoyed the story, but it was too dark, so I went ahead and just quit reading it. When a story promotes giving up, it makes it really hard for a reader to emotionally engage with it, which also means that it makes it really hard for you to teach that reader your own philosophy or help that reader come around to seeing your point of view. So if you are not trying to just make people miserable, it is important to make sure that you can add positive reinforcement to the behaviors or philosophies that you do agree with into that story. Again, we talk about secondary characters doing the right thing. That is also a great way to fix this problem. Or if you can show survival after the main character is either destroyed figuratively or literally, so that there is still hope. Uh, Generally speaking, you know, these really dark stories, making sure there's enough hope without it becoming too positive is something that you're going to have to like balance, because you may be telling a dark story and it may have a really miserable ending, and your point is that, you know, thinking this way will end in tragedy. But you have to give a wiggle to what they should be doing instead. And then you need to be careful about accidentally reinforcing traditions and standards while you are trying to while you're trying to fight against a particular one. So if we are looking at a story where, say, there's a politician and we're pointing out the way that they aren't ethical, and they happen to be cheating on their wife, we can easily maneuver over into blame territory for the sex workers or the frigid wives, or make them accountable for that bad character's behavior. And give this sort of reflexive view that they're at fault just as much as he is, and that we should judge sex workers or judge people who have alternate lifestyles And we want to make sure we don't do that, right? Like if your whole goal is to focus on what a liar and hypocrite this guy is, then you want to make sure that you're not accidentally penalizing those that just happen to be in their sphere. Focus again when you get this kind of criticism on, did you fuck up with your tropes characters? Did you use a persecuted class or community to prop up your assertions and conclusions? And then what can you do to go back and fix that in your next draft? And then also giving back pats for doing nothing is something that people tend to say. Like when you're preaching to the choir too much, and they're only reinforcing existing beliefs, then anybody who's not already part of the same kind of culture or group that you are in, they're not going to get a whole lot of out of it. Um, you may also accidentally obfuscate the real issue by trying to be too funny. And if that happens, you need to go back and figure out what the core issue is that you're trying to fight against in your story and make sure that that's carried through the climax. All right, I'm trying to go a little bit faster because I'm almost done. All right, benefits. Like I've made it sound like it's hard. Why do we do this? Why have people been doing it since before we could write? What's going on? Satire is a form of tactical frivolity, and I think it's really important right now. It's probably always really important, but it feels incredibly important right now. When you look at, there being actual armed forces on the streets of major cities, and you have people in giant frog costumes dancing in front of them to show off the ridiculousness of the militant behavior. This kind of tactical frivolity has existed for many, many centuries, where we show off the pomp and pretentiousness and ridiculousness of how people are acting in one way or another. And showing it through satire is just one of those tools to do it. The other thing it does is it engages audiences through humor for stories that are funny. People may not be willing to engage with subject matter that is too emotionally fraught, but once they make them laugh, then they're willing to, to come through because they've got a carrot. It operates more freely than direct criticism in a lot of societies where we don't have freedom of speech. If you can't be sure who that person is making fun of or what they're saying, and on its face, it just looks like comedy, then that particular piece has much more opportunity to reach an audience than one that would be a direct indictment of people who are in power. Placing moral questions in speculative settings, or placing a spotlight on a philosophy, belief system type of behavior in a speculative setting creates enough emotional distance that people who are readers are less likely to reflexively protect themselves if they see themselves represented in a character, than they would if they were being shown a character in a realistic setting or circumstance. Basically, making it fantastical makes this more safe for them to read and emotionally engage with and objectively evaluate. And then they're more likely to take the ideas from your story and alter their own lifestyle. So it is a means to teach if it's done right. And then when you are dealing with people who are in power that are using fear or threat, or that they are going to harm somebody, or harm people that they love, and that is how they quell uprisings or compel submission, making them look like a giant bird with a huge penis is one way to knock the wind out of their sails and make them appear less scary than they intend to be, to show them as not as powerful or as dangerous as they want people to believe. So, this is why we do it. I absolutely think you should go out there and write satire if you have something to say, or if you're clever. Cleverness is great. But this has been my 101 on writing speculative satire. If you have questions, please ask them now. We are past time. I apologize. But if you do have questions or you want to say anything about stories that you've written, or you just want to continue the conversation, you can find me mostly through the Tomeworks website, or you can email me directly at shannon@tomeworksedits.com. If you're looking for an editor, you can find us there as well. And that is what I've got. Sean, do we have any questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, Anna, I am done. You want to tell us what we're doing next week?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, next week I'm going to be talking about filter verbs. So if you've ever heard the term filter verb and you're not really sure what those are, or you don't have a list of filter verbs, you're not really sure which verbs fit into that category, we're going to talk about all of that, and we're going to do some writing exercises with filter verbs as well. So it should be pretty fun. But yeah, we hope to see you there next week.
Sounds great. We are here every Thursday. I'm going to get those events up this afternoon or tomorrow morning, but you can always follow us at Houston Independent Authors on Eventbrite and on Meetup to find more. Or you can find us on our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Tomeworks Edits. You can just look up Facebook Tomeworks Edits, and we put all of our information about our events there as well. All right, thank you guys. I hope you've learned something, and we'll see you next time for a fun